Welcome to this wild story about one of the craziest things that ever happened in New Orleans history. Before we start, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and exactly what time you're listening to this. We really want to know which places and what times people are hearing these wild true stories. So back in the super hot summer of 1838, New Orleans was this mix of French, Spanish, and American cultures all squished together. And on Burgundy Street, two people made a promise that people would talk about for generations. A cotton businessman named Nathaniel Budrow and a woman named Adeline Harper, who had just gotten her freedom, both disappeared, and it sent shockwaves through a city that had very strict rules about who could be with who. What started as quiet gossip in the fancy part of town got way more creepy when investigators found an empty carriage sitting at the edge of Bayou St. John. The seats had dark stains that looked like ink, or maybe something a lot worse. According to old church records found during a courthouse fix-up in 1962, Nathaniel Budrow had paid to free Adeline Harper just 3 days before they both vanished. The document was old and water-damaged, but it had both of their signatures on it, plus the stamp of a notary, a document official named James Wilson, who later said he had never even met either of them. That lie was just the first in a whole web of half-truths and silence that covered up this case for over 100 years. The Budrow family's big house still stands on Plantation Street, but it has changed hands tons of times since 1838. History buffs have noticed that no owner has ever stayed longer than 7 years. Old property records show the house was worth a lot of money but kept being sold for way less than it should have been. People who lived there and talked to a magazine in 1968 said certain rooms, especially the library and the old master bedroom upstairs, felt weirdly heavy and still, like something was off. Before all the drama of August 1838, the Budrow family was a big deal in New Orleans. Nathaniel was 42 years old and the oldest son of a French immigrant dad who had made a fortune selling cotton. Old business letters kept at the Williams Research Center show the family had connections all the way to Paris, London, and New York. The Budrow name showed up all the time in fancy social announcements, and their parties were known for being over the top, even in a city famous for going all out. What we know about Adeline Harper mostly comes from old sale documents and one diary entry written by Elizabeth Budrow, Nathaniel's mom. The entry, written on April 12, 1837, mentions the girl with the unusual eyes who had been bought from a plantation in St. Bernard Parish. Elizabeth wrote that her son had paid way too much money for Adeline, who was described as someone who could read and was good at managing a household. The diary never mentions Adeline again, but household spending records show that a lot more money was being spent on fabrics and a dressmaker in the months right before the disappearance. New Orleans in the 1830s was split up very carefully by race and social class, with hard lines between white people, free black people, and enslaved people. According to historian Dr. Margaret Calloway, whose 1961 book Whispers from the Quarter is still one of the best on the subject, relationships that crossed those lines weren't unheard of, but they happened in secret. People talked about them in hushed voices behind closed doors, acknowledged them with knowing looks at parties, but never said anything out loud. The summer of 1838 was crazy hot, even for Louisiana. Newspaper stories from July said the streets were basically empty during the day, with people only going out in the early morning or after the sun went down. It was during this sweltering time that Nathaniel Budrow started skipping his usual social stuff. He turned down invitations and put off business meetings. Letters between his mom Elizabeth and her sister in Baltimore, found during a cleanup of the family crypt in 1958, show that Nathaniel had gotten secretive and distracted, spending hours locked in his study. It was around this same time that Adeline Harper's life changed in a big way. On August 10, 1838, official papers were filed that transferred ownership of one female slave, Adeline, approximately 23 years of age, to Adeline herself. Both Nathaniel and Adeline signed the document. Adeline's signature was surprisingly elegant for someone who had been denied a proper education. Just 3 days later, both Nathaniel and Adeline were gone. The first investigation was pretty half-hearted, honestly. According to police reports saved in the city's records, Elizabeth Budrow reported her son missing on August 16, 3 days after he failed to show up to a business meeting. The report doesn't mention Adeline Harper at all. When people asked her later, Elizabeth said she had no idea her son had freed Adeline or what he was planning. The officer on the case, Lieutenant Robert Murphy, wrote that the family seemed more interested in keeping things quiet than actually finding out what happened. The abandoned carriage found near Bayou St. John on August 20th was the first real clue that something worse than a scandalous runaway romance might have happened. The carriage was identified as the Budrow family's by its special crest on the side. Inside, investigators found a man's hat, probably Nathaniel's, and a small bag of women's clothing. Most disturbing was the dark staining on the seats, first described as ink, but later changed in the report to substance of unknown origin. No one ever did any further testing on it. The case might have been completely forgotten if not for a letter found in 1959 during the demolition of an old boarding house on Rampart Street. The letter was written on fancy paper in neat handwriting, addressed to my dearest A, and signed just N. It talked about a plan to go to France where they could live openly as husband and wife without society judging them. The letter was dated August 12, 1838, the day before they disappeared. It ended with a creepy little note: "Beware the one who watches from the shadows. He has made his intentions clear." That mention of some mysterious third person changed the whole story, from a forbidden love tale to something possibly way darker. After that, an amateur historian named William Crawford dug deeper in 1963 and found old business letters suggesting Nathaniel Budrow had been in a serious dispute with some powerful merchants in the weeks before he vanished. Crawford's notes, published after his death in 1967, said the argument was about shipping routes and accusations of price fixing. One letter from a merchant named Thomas Reynolds basically said, "Your recent choices show really bad judgment." One wonders what other parts of your life are suffering too. The Reynolds family was one of the oldest and most powerful in New Orleans. Their house on Esplanade Avenue was just a short distance from the Budrow home, and the families ran in the same social circles. Thomas Reynolds had a daughter named Caroline who, according to a society column from January 1838, was expected to get engaged to the eligible Mr. Budrow before the year was up. That engagement never happened. The connection between the Reynolds family and the disappearances went unexplored for decades. It wasn't until 1957 that a grad student named James Landry, researching old business practices for his school dissertation, stumbled upon accounting records from the Reynolds Shipping Company. Hidden among the normal entries were payments to people identified only by initials, with notes that Landry thought were location coordinates along the Mississippi River. One entry from August 14, 1838 read simply, "JM, final payment package secured." Landry never got to publish his research. According to university records, he quit his dissertation in 1958 after what his colleagues called an episode of extreme paranoia. He left New Orleans suddenly, reportedly telling his professor that he felt like he was constantly being watched. Nobody knew what happened to him until a short obituary showed up in a Minneapolis newspaper in 1966, saying Landry had struggled with mental health issues since leaving Louisiana. The JM in the ledger might have been James Monroe, a person who shows up in New Orleans police records as someone with special talents, who was sometimes hired by rich families when normal methods didn't cut it. Monroe's name pops up in connection with several cases from the 1830s and 40s, though he was never officially charged with anything. Census records place him on Dufine Street, less than half a mile from both the Budrow and Reynolds homes. What actually happened on the night of August 13, 1838 is mostly guesswork. The carriage was found about 7 miles from the city center, in an area that back then would have been totally isolated and full of thick trees. No bodies were ever found, even though police records say they searched the surrounding swamps and waterways. The search was called off after 5 days, with Lieutenant Murphy writing that further expenditure of resources seems unwarranted given the circumstances. Those circumstances, politely worded in the report, probably meant the whole scandal of it. A big-name white businessman disappearing with a recently freed black woman was embarrassing enough that people wanted to sweep it under the rug, and if powerful families were mixed up in it too, there was even more reason to quietly close the case. In 1841, Elizabeth Budrow paid for a memorial stone in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. No body was buried there, it just had Nathaniel's name and his birth and assumed death dates. Adeline Harper wasn't acknowledged at all. The Budrow business was slowly sold off over the next decade, and Elizabeth eventually moved back to her family in Baltimore, where she died in 1853. She left behind a sealed letter addressed to her dead son, which is still in the collection of the Maryland Historical Society. The letter wasn't opened until 1960, when a researcher named Catherine Martin got access for a study on old family letters. According to Martin's notes, Elizabeth wrote about deep regret for actions taken in haste and misguided concern for our family's position. She asked forgiveness for letting fear win over a mother's love and for listening to those who claimed to have our interests at heart. Most telling of all, she wrote, "I know now that the darkness that descended that night was of our own making, not yours." That kind of comment could mean the family's loss of status after the scandal, or it could hint at something way more literal. Local folklore has kept another side of this story alive, one that never made it into official records. Anthropologist Marie Devo collected stories from the area in 1955, including one from an old woman whose grandmother had lived near Bayou St. John in the 1830s. She described a lady in white who walks among the cypress trees, forever searching for something she'll never find. Another story talked about the sound of carriage wheels rolling on nights with no moon, moving along a road that doesn't exist anymore. Devo noted that these kinds of stories are common in a city as old and layered as New Orleans and should be treated as cultural history rather than fact. But they show how the disappearance of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper seeped into the community's memory, slowly turning from scandal to legend. In 1959, construction workers building a new road near the original Bayou site dug up what their report called a collection of personal effects buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The items included a pocket watch with the initials NB engraved on it, several coins from the 1830s, and bits of what appeared to be a woman's hair comb. The spot was about 50 yards from where the carriage had been found more than a century earlier. The discovery briefly brought the case back into the spotlight. The Times-Picayune ran a feature story called Century-Old Mystery Resurfaces, summarizing what was known and guessing at explanations. The artifacts were transferred to the Louisiana State Museum, where they were mostly forgotten until historian Robert Bell asked to look at them in 1967 for his book Silenced Narratives, Lost Voices of the Antebellum South. Bell's examination of the pocket watch found an inscription inside the case that hadn't been noted before. To NB, may time be kind to our future. The closeness of that message, combined with how expensive the gift clearly was, suggested Nathaniel and Adeline had a relationship that went way beyond what their social positions were supposed to allow. Bell also found a detail in the Freedom Papers that everyone had overlooked. The document didn't just grant Adeline her freedom, it also gave her ownership of a small piece of land outside the city. Tax records from 1838 show that Nathaniel had bought the property 6 months earlier. It was a modest house with several acres of land along what is now called Gently Boulevard, but back then was well outside city limits. This suggests the whole thing was planned carefully and wasn't just some sudden decision to run away together. Nathaniel seems to have been quietly and methodically setting Adeline up to live as an independent woman with enough money to take care of herself. Arrangements like this weren't unheard of in New Orleans at the time, but they were usually done more secretly, often through go-betweens, not direct property transfers. The most powerful evidence about what really happened to Nathaniel and Adeline turned up in 1962, when a bundle of letters was found in the attic of a house being renovated in the Marigny district. The letters, spanning September 1838 to July 1839, were written by someone who only identified herself as A, to a person she called dearest sister. They described life in a small community outside Boston, where the writer and her unnamed companion had settled after leaving New Orleans under circumstances too painful to commit to paper. The letters are full of careful, coded language about their old life, mentioning the necessity of our sudden departure and those who would prevent our happiness at any cost. One passage from December 1838 reads, "Nils suffers from the injuries sustained during our journey, but the physician assures us that with time and proper care, he will regain much of his former strength. I thank Providence daily that we escaped with our lives, though the price was dear." Whether these letters are real has been debated among historians. The handwriting looks similar to Adeline's signature on the Freedom Papers, but without more samples to compare, nobody can say for sure. The paper and ink are consistent with what was available in the late 1830s, according to an analysis done by the historic New Orleans collection in 1964. If they're real, the letters suggest Nathaniel and Adeline survived whatever went down near Bayou St. John, though not without getting hurt, and made it to the northern states where their relationship would face far fewer restrictions than in the Deep South. The letters never mention marriage, but they clearly describe a shared life, our home, our small garden, plans for the future. Who the dearest sister was remains unknown. Adeline Harper's family connections aren't in any surviving records, but it wasn't unusual for enslaved people to keep in touch with family members even after being separated by sale or inheritance. The possibility that she had a free sister already living up north is plausible, just unconfirmed. The last letter in the collection, dated July 23, 1839, says the writer is worried about unspecified rumors that have reached us from Louisiana, and that they're thinking about moving again, possibly to Canada, where certain legal claims would hold no weight. This suggests that almost a full year after they disappeared, Nathaniel and Adeline were still afraid of being found or dragged back into a legal mess. No more letters have ever been discovered. The historical record just goes quiet. The story might have stayed buried, an interesting but inconclusive footnote in history, if not for a discovery in 1965 during excavation for a new building near Porter Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Workers uncovered a small family cemetery that had been paved over sometime in the late 1800s. Among the graves was one marked with a simple stone bearing the initials AB and NB, and the dates 1815, 1872, and 1796, 1869. City records identified the plot as belonging to the Brown family, who had run a small printing business in Cambridge from 1840 through 1880. According to tax documents, the business was started by Nathan Brown and wife Abigail, recently arrived from the South. A daguerreotype photograph from around 1855, found in the archives of the Cambridge Historical Society, shows an older man with a walking stick sitting next to a woman whose features suggest mixed-race ancestry, though the image quality makes it impossible to say for sure who they are. If Nathan and Abigail Brown were actually Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper living under fake names, they managed to build a whole new life far away from the harsh rules of New Orleans society. The printing business appears to have been modestly successful, and records show they were involved in local abolitionist activities, making small but regular donations to anti-slavery publications and causes. She writes of spotting a face from the past at a literary society meeting, describing a moment of mutual recognition and equally mutual decision to acknowledge nothing. She continues, "Some ghosts are best left undisturbed, particularly when they have found peace in their haunting." This chance run-in, if it really was with the former Adeline Harper, suggests that whatever fears were expressed in that final 1839 letter eventually faded enough for the couple to live a public, if very careful, life in Massachusetts. Perhaps the most interesting thing is an entry in the diary of Caroline Reynolds, daughter of Thomas Reynolds, dated October 1857 during a visit to Boston. It seems to suggest that whatever role the Reynolds family may have played in the events of 1838, by 1857, at least Caroline had come to some kind of peace with how things turned out. The graves in Cambridge were moved during the 1965 construction project, and the remains were reburied in Mount Auburn Cemetery with the original grave marker preserved. In 1968, on the 130th anniversary of the disappearance, a small ceremony was held at the grave site, attended mostly by historians and researchers who had studied the case. One of them was Dr. Eliza Johnson, a direct descendant of James Wilson, the notary whose stamp had appeared on Adeline's Freedom Papers. According to Dr. Johnson, family tradition said that her ancestor actually had processed those papers, despite publicly denying it. Wilson had reportedly told his daughter in private, a secret passed down through generations, that Nathaniel Budrow had shown up late one night, clearly panicked, and insisted the documents be completed immediately and without the usual witnesses. Wilson went along with it, sensing the urgency even if he didn't understand the reason, only to find out days later that the couple had vanished. He denied ever meeting them out of fear of being linked to the scandal and possibly facing legal trouble. The Budrow Mansion on Prytania Street changed hands again in 1969, bought by a historical preservation society that restored it to look like it did in the antebellum era. Tour guides now mention the disappearance of Nathaniel and Adeline as part of the house's colorful history, though the story they tell leans more toward romantic elopement than the darker possibilities the evidence suggests. The carriage site near Bayou St. John has been swallowed by urban development, and the exact location is no longer certain. Local residents still occasionally report strange sounds on especially still nights. The faint clatter of wheels in the distance, or the soft splash of something entering the water. Stories like these are embraced as part of New Orleans' rich tradition of ghost stories, whether or not they have any historical basis. What nobody disputes is that in the summer of 1838, two people vanished from a society that refused to make room for their relationship. The evidence suggests they may have survived and built a life somewhere else, though not without a real fight and real sacrifice. Their story, pieced together from scraps of evidence spread across more than a century, speaks to something deeply human: the cruelty people face and the courage they find, the violence they survive and the endurance they discover. The graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery have only initials on them, their real identities still a matter of debate among historians. Maybe that ambiguity is fitting, a final act of privacy for two people who fought so hard, against so many obstacles, to control their own destiny in a world that kept trying to take that right away from them. The silence around most of their story isn't empty, it's full of unspoken choices, prices paid, and promises kept no matter what. In the end, what we know for certain about Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper is way smaller than what remains hidden. The records are incomplete, the witness is long gone. What sticks around is the outline of a story that makes us rethink the past and wonder about all the other stories that never made it into the history books, lives lived in the margins and the shadows, searching for little pockets of freedom in a world built to keep them out. Maybe the most powerful thing ever written about this case comes from the final page of Robert Bell's Silence Narratives, published in 1968, just months before he died. History is not merely what is documented, but also what is deliberately undocumented. Not just what is said, but what is carefully left unsaid. In the spaces between official records, in contradictions and convenient omissions, we glimpse the true complexity of the past and recognize how often the most human stories are those deemed too dangerous to tell. The pocket watch recovered near Bayou St. John with its hidden inscription is still in the collection of the Louisiana State Museum. Visitors who ask to see it are sometimes told it's not currently on display or that it's been temporarily taken for conservation. Some staff members, speaking off the record, hint that the watch has a strange habit of stopping at exactly 13 minutes past 10, no matter how recently it's been wound. Whether that's a mechanical glitch, a coincidence, or something harder to explain remains, like so much else in this story, just a matter of guessing. On August 13, 1838, a carriage traveled the dark road along Bayou St. John. Whatever happened there has rippled through the generations, shifting over time from scandal to mystery to legend. The truth is buried in pieces: a pocket watch, a handful of letters, an unmarked grave far from home. Some doors once shut stay shut for reasons that outlive the people who closed them, and some promises once made keep echoing long after the people who made them have gone back to dust. In 1963, an elderly woman named Martha Collins contacted the Louisiana Historical Society with a surprising claim. According to family papers passed down through generations, her great-great-grandmother had been a housekeeper for the Reynolds family in the late 1830s. That woman, recorded as Sarah Jenkins, had reportedly witnessed a heated argument between Thomas Reynolds and Nathaniel Budrow just days before the disappearance. Collins submitted several pages from what seemed to be a personal journal, in which Sarah described overhearing Reynolds threaten Budrow about the impropriety of certain attachments and the consequences of pursuing such a ruinous course. Some historians have questioned whether those journal pages are real, especially since they showed up more than 100 years after the events they describe. A handwriting analysis done in 1964 was inconclusive, though the paper was consistent with 19th century materials. Real or not, the account lines up with other evidence pointing to the Reynolds family having both personal and financial reasons to want Nathaniel Budrow out of the picture. What is documented for certain is that Thomas Reynolds Shipping Company had a major expansion in late 1838 and 1839, snapping up several routes and contracts that had previously belonged to Budrow. Business records show that Reynolds bought up the outstanding shares of Budrow's company at way below market value, transactions approved by Elizabeth Budrow as the manager of her son's estate. The timing of these deals, coming so soon after Nathaniel's disappearance, has led some researchers to see it at the very least as cold-blooded opportunism. In 1966, an architectural historian named Edward Lambert doing research on antebellum homes in New Orleans, found a hidden space in the Budrow mansion on Prytania Street that nobody had known about. While examining the building's original floor plans, Lambert spotted weird inconsistencies in the measurements on the second floor. Careful measuring revealed a narrow space between the master bedroom and the sitting room next to it, accessible only through a hidden door in what had been Nathaniel's private study. The hidden room, about 6 feet by 8 feet, had no windows and appeared to have been sealed up sometime in the late 1800s. Inside, Lambert found nothing but an empty shelf and the remains of what might have been a small desk or writing table. The walls showed signs of serious water damage, even though the surrounding rooms had no similar damage at all. Lambert's report, filed with the historic New Orleans collection, suggests the room might have been a secure place to store business documents or valuables. But given what we know about Nathaniel's relationship with Adeline, some historians have floated another idea, that the room might have been used for secret meetings, or even as temporary hiding quarters for Adeline during times when her presence in the main house would have raised eyebrows. That theory got more fuel in 1967, when restoration workers found a small stash of items hidden behind a loose brick in the hidden room's wall. The items included a silver locket with a lock of dark hair inside, a small notebook filled with what appeared to be poetry in a woman's handwriting, and a carefully folded document that crumbled the moment it was exposed to air. Before it fell apart, the partial text visible suggested it might have been a ship's passenger list or a booking confirmation. The notebook had no name in it, but several poems made references to eyes the color of the Mississippi in winter and hands that built empires yet tremble at my touch. One entry, dated June 4, 1838, reads, 2 months until freedom comes on paper what has long existed in heart, then the journey begins across water to shores where we might simply be. This timeline matches up with Adeline's freedom papers being filed in early August and the disappearance that followed, suggesting their departure had been planned way in advance. The fact that these items were left behind in the house rather than taken with them might mean their final escape happened more suddenly or under very different circumstances than originally planned. In October 1968, a grad student in American literature named Rebecca Martin made a potentially huge discovery while researching 19th-century abolitionist publications. In an obscure Boston literary journal called The Liberty Bell, published in 1842, she found a short story called The Promise. Attributed to A.B., the story describes a couple escaping New Orleans under cover of darkness, being chased by men hired by the woman's former enslaver. The fictional couple eventually reaches safety in Massachusetts, where they live under assumed names, though the man never fully recovers from his injuries, and the woman is haunted by knowing that blood was the price of our beginning. The story ends with the couple visiting the grave of one of their pursuers, a place where flowers now bloom over old hatreds. While it's presented as fiction, certain details match the known facts of the Budrow Harper case so closely that many scholars believe it might be a thinly veiled account of real events. In the story, the couple is ambushed near a bayou, leading to a violent confrontation that leaves the man seriously wounded and one of their pursuers dead. The bayou setting, the specific nature of the man's injuries, a gunshot wound to the leg that leaves him permanently lame, and references to the cotton trade all suggest autobiographical elements. If A.B. was in fact Adeline writing under her assumed identity of Abigail Brown, this story gives us the most detailed account we have of what might have happened on the night of August 13, 1838. It suggests the couple was ambushed while trying to escape, and the confrontation left both physical and emotional scars. The reference to visiting the grave of their pursuers is still a mystery, since no records show any Reynolds family members or associates being buried in Massachusetts. The Liberty Bell was published every year as a fundraiser for the anti-slavery movement, with contributions from both well-known and amateur writers. Its 1842 edition included work by some prominent abolitionists, including Wendell Phillips and Maria Weston Chapman. Being included in that publication suggests that by then, A.B. had at least some connections within Boston's abolitionist circles. Rebecca Martin's further research turned up more writings possibly from the same author in various reform-minded publications through the 1840s and 50s. These included essays on education for freed slaves, the moral case for abolition, and most interestingly, a piece arguing for legal recognition of marriages across racial lines. That last essay, published in 1849, argued that love, once it exists, recognizes no boundaries of color or condition, and the laws that would constrain it are an affront to both nature and God. The Cambridge printing business, owned by Nathan and Abigail Brown, was responsible for producing several of these publications, according to printers' marks and business records from the period. The modest operation seems to have specialized in reform-minded literature, which suggests that if Nathaniel and Adeline did rebuild their lives as the Browns, they stayed committed to the cause of abolition and racial equality, even while keeping a low profile to stay safe. The grave site in Mount Auburn Cemetery became a point of interest for historians and civil rights activists in the 1960s. In 1968, at the height of the civil rights movement, a small bronze plaque was added near the original gravestone. It read, "Here may lie Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, whose quest for love and freedom defied the boundaries of their time. Their story reminds us that the struggle for human dignity has many unsung heroes." The careful wording, "Here may lie," acknowledges the ongoing historical uncertainty while still honoring the symbolic importance of what they did. That same year, historian Caroline Jefferson did an exhaustive search of Cambridge city records from 1840 through 1872. She discovered that the Browns had bought their home in 1842 after previously renting rooms above their print shop. Tax records show modest but steady growth over the years, with the business expanding to include a small bookshop by 1850. Most significantly, Jefferson found a death certificate for Abigail Brown dated April 17, 1872. The cause of death was listed as tuberculosis, and her age was recorded as approximately 57 years, which would match the estimated birth year of Adeline Harper. Her birthplace was listed simply as Louisiana, and the document was signed by Dr. William Harrison, a doctor known for treating many in Cambridge's small black community. Nathan Brown's death certificate from 1869 listed complications from long-standing injury to the lower extremity as a contributing cause, with pneumonia as the immediate cause of death. His birthplace was recorded as New Orleans, his occupation as printer and bookseller. The document was witnessed by Abigail Brown, listed as his wife, and by James Brown, described as their son. The existence of this son, who hadn't been known to researchers before, opened up whole new lines of inquiry. Jefferson's continued digging revealed that James Brown, born around 1844 based on census records, attended Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the only schools of higher education that accepted black students at the time. He later returned to Cambridge to work in the family printing business and got involved in local politics during Reconstruction. If James was indeed the son of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, his birth in 1844 would mean the couple had established themselves enough in their new identities to start a family within a few years of their escape from New Orleans. Census records from 1850 describe James as mulatto, suggesting that Abigail's mixed-race background was acknowledged to census takers rather than hidden entirely. The fate of James Brown after his parents' deaths remained unclear until 1969, when Jefferson found a newspaper notice from 1874 announcing his move to Washington, D.C., where he had taken a position with the Freedmen's Bureau. Later records show he married a schoolteacher named Sarah Williams in 1876 and had 3 children. His descendants, unaware of any possible connection to the Budrow Harper story, continued to live in the Washington area well into the 20th century. In 1967, Dr. Robert Bell, whose book Silenced Narratives had brought new attention to the case, received an anonymous package containing a small leather-bound book. The book, with pages brittle from age, appeared to be a personal diary covering September 1838 to December 1842. The entries, written in a precise hand, detailed the early years of life in Massachusetts for N and A after their escape from New Orleans. According to these entries, the couple first lived in Salem, Massachusetts, before moving to Cambridge in 1840 to start the printing business. The writer, presumably Nathaniel or Nathan, described ongoing pain from a gunshot wound to his right leg and occasional nightmares about what happened at the bayou. He mentioned regular letters with A's sister in Philadelphia, who apparently served as a go-between for news from New Orleans. An entry from July 1839 described their reaction to learning of R's unexpected demise, noting that though one cannot rejoice in another's death, there is undeniable relief in knowing that particular shadow no longer darkens our path. This might refer to Thomas Reynolds, who, according to New Orleans obituary records, died suddenly in June 1839 from what was described as apoplexy, probably a stroke. The diary also mentioned a growing circle of trusted friends in abolitionist circles, though it noted that even among those committed to the cause, our particular circumstances required discretion. Several entries mentioned visits from William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist publisher, who apparently offered advice on developing their printing business for reform-oriented publications. Most touching of all, the diary recorded the couple's reaction to the birth of their son in February 1844. That entry, longer and more emotional than most, described the event as the culmination of a promise made years ago beside moon-dappled waters, when we pledged that whatever life we might forge would be truly free, not just for ourselves, but for any who might come after. Today, holding him in my arms, I know that every risk was justified, every sacrifice worthwhile. The authenticity of this diary has been debated, especially since the person who sent it remains unknown. Bell himself, in his final interview before his death in 1968, said he believed the diary was genuine, citing details that matched independently verified facts about the Browns' life in Massachusetts. He guessed the diary might have been preserved by descendants of James Brown, who had recently discovered its historical significance, but wanted to stay anonymous because of the complicated racial history involved. In 1968, the New Orleans City Council considered a proposal to rename a small park near Bayou St. John in honor of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper. The proposal, introduced by the city's first black councilman, sparked a heated debate. Opponents argued that the historical identification was still uncertain, and that honoring an interracial relationship from the antebellum period might divide people rather than bring them together. Supporters countered that the story, whether precisely true or partly legend, represented important themes of courage and resistance to unjust social rules. The compromise was a simple stone bench placed at roughly the spot where the carriage had been found, with the inscription, "In remembrance of all those whose stories of love and courage remain untold." The bench was dedicated in a small ceremony on August 13, 1969, the 131st anniversary of the disappearance. Among those present was an elderly woman named Clara Williams, identified in newspaper accounts as a great-granddaughter of James Brown of Cambridge. Williams, then in her 70s, had traveled from Washington specifically for the ceremony. In a brief statement to the Times-Picayune, she acknowledged that family tradition had long included stories of ancestors who fled the South under difficult circumstances, though the specific connection to the Budrow Harper story had only recently come to light through the work of historians like Jefferson and Bell. Williams said she had found letters and photographs in her grandmother's belongings after her death in 1953, items that had been carefully kept but rarely talked about. Among them was a daguerreotype believed to be of Nathan and Abigail Brown in their later years, and a letter from Abigail to her son James, written shortly before her death, in which she reflected on the journey of her life. That letter, later donated to the historic New Orleans collection, contains what many consider the most direct confirmation of Abigail Brown's identity as the former Adeline Harper. In it she wrote, "The name under which I have lived these many years was not the one given to me at birth, nor the one under which I first knew both bondage and its ending, but it became truly mine through choice rather than imposition, and in that lies a freedom more profound than mere legal status." She continued, "What happened that night by the water's edge changed us both in ways beyond the physical scars your father carried to his grave. I have never spoken of it fully, not even to you, my son. Some memories are best left undisturbed, like the still waters of the bayou that witness much but reveal little. Know only that the life we built here, the family we created, grew from soil watered with both blood and tears, and that its flowering has been the redemption of all that came before." The letter ends with a request that after her death, her wedding ring be buried with her, returning to the earth the symbol of a promise that defied a world arranged to prevent it. According to cemetery records, when Abigail Brown was laid to rest beside her husband in 1872, her son honored that wish. In 1969, as part of the ongoing restoration of the Budrow mansion, workers discovered a small recess behind the fireplace in Nathaniel's study. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman whose features suggested mixed-race ancestry. The portrait, painted on ivory in the style common in the 1830s, had no signature or label. Art historians who examined it noted its exceptional quality and estimated it was quite valuable, suggesting it had been commissioned from one of the more skilled portrait painters working in New Orleans at the time. The woman in the portrait wears a simple blue dress with a white collar, her dark hair arranged in the style of the period. Most striking are her eyes, which one historian described as conveying a sense of quiet determination beneath their surface calm. The portrait now hangs in the historic New Orleans collection, labeled simply Unknown Woman, c. 1837, though many visitors recognize it as the presumed image of Adeline Harper. The story of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, pieced together from fragments across more than a century, is still incomplete. Historical certainty keeps slipping away, as it often does when we look at lives lived in opposition to the prevailing rules of the time. What evidence does exist suggests they may have succeeded in their quest for a life together, though at great cost. Their journey from the rigid restrictions of antebellum New Orleans to the relative freedom of Massachusetts wasn't just a physical trip. It was a crossing of every boundary their society had declared to be permanent and unchangeable. In the decades after the Civil War and Reconstruction, as the promise of racial equality crumbled under the weight of Jim Crow laws and renewed segregation, the story of Nathaniel and Adeline could have offered a different vision of what was possible if it hadn't been buried under layers of silence and deliberate forgetting. It resurfaced in the mid-20th century alongside renewed struggles for civil rights and racial justice, a reminder that resistance to oppressive systems takes many forms, some loud and public, others quiet and hidden. If the Browns of Cambridge really were Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper, they created a life that embodied the principles of freedom and equality in both personal and political ways. Their printing business served the abolitionist movement that fought to end the very system they had fled. Their son got an education and opportunities that would have been completely unthinkable for him in the South. Their marriage, while probably never fully acknowledged in public, appears to have lasted more than 30 years, held together by mutual commitment in the face of extraordinary challenges. The pocket watch recovered near Bayou St. John, with its hidden inscription promising a future that time might treat kindly, remains one of the few physical connections to their story. Whether that promise was ultimately kept is a question each person who encounters their story has to answer for themselves. What seems clear is that in a world determined to deny their humanity and their connection to each other, Nathaniel and Adeline chose to chart their own path, no matter the cost. Their graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery, marked only with initials and dates, lie beneath towering oak trees in one of the first garden cemeteries in America, a place designed to celebrate life even as it commemorates death. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or small stones, traditional tokens of remembrance from many cultures. The bench near Bayou St. John, far to the south, offers a different kind of memorial, a place to sit and think about all the stories history hasn't fully preserved or acknowledged. In his final public lecture before he died, historian Robert Bell observed that history isn't just a record of what happened, it's a conversation about what matters. The story of Nathaniel Budrow and Adeline Harper matters because it reminds us that behind the broad strokes of historical events, slavery, abolition, Civil War, Reconstruction, there are countless individual lives, each one navigating its own complicated mix of constraint and possibility, courage and compromise, love and loss. The carriage that traveled alongside Bayou St. John on that August night in 1838 carried two people determined to build a future different from what their society had laid out for them. What happened on that journey changed not just their lives, but eventually our understanding of the past they lived in. Their story, emerging from the shadows after more than a century, invites us to ask how many other stories are still out there waiting to be found, how many other lives defied the categories and assumptions that shape the way we see history. In the end, maybe the most profound part of their legacy isn't what we know, but what we're led to question about the past, about the human capacity for both cruelty and courage, and about the enduring power of promises made against all odds.